Friday evenings used to mean pizza, sweatpants, and pretending I would finally organize the garage. Instead, I spent 2 hours at an auto shop because my truck had decided that functioning properly was apparently optional. By the time I got home, I was tired, hungry, and smelling faintly like engine oil and bad financial decisions. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. Jane's friends, Sarah, Meredith, and Thea, were all sitting around our dining table with wine glasses in their hands and the kind of expressions people usually have right before joining a cult. There were empty dessert plates everywhere, a half-finished charcuterie board, and enough scented candles burning to summon a Victorian ghost. "Hey, babe," Jane said way too cheerfully. Sarah smiled. Meredith actually looked excited. Thea had her phone out like she was documenting history. I hadn't even taken off my jacket yet when Jane stood up, holding a printed sheet of paper. She smiled proudly and said, "I've created a marriage scorecard." I blinked. "I'm sorry," I said. "A what?" She handed me the paper. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "William's husband scorecard. Romance, 4/10, support, 5/10, appearance, 4/10, finances, 5/10. Overall husband rating, 4.5/10. Now, I want to be clear about something. In the 10 seconds it took me to read that paper, I cycled through about 4 distinct emotional stages. First came confusion. Genuine, honest confusion. The kind where your brain just quietly refuses to process the information. Then came something close to amusement, because come on. Then there was a flicker of actual offense, because 4.5? Really? I've had worse weeks, sure, but I didn't think they were documented. And finally, and this is the part that surprised even me, I got curious. But before I could say a single word, Sarah, Meredith, and Thea all started doing that thing women do when they sense a situation is about to become complicated. Bags were being gathered, phones were being slipped into pockets. Thea actually took one last photo of the charcuterie board like she needed the memory for comfort. "Oh, you don't have to rush out," I said, still holding the scorecard. I kept my voice very calm, very pleasant. The kind of pleasant that has a foundation of something else entirely underneath it. All 3 of them stopped moving. "I actually have a couple of questions," I said. "And since this was clearly a group project, I'd love the full team present for the debrief." Jane looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the one she uses when she's trying to figure out if I'm genuinely calm or if I'm doing the thing where I'm too calm. For the record, it was the second one. But I wasn't angry. I was genuinely, legitimately curious. "So," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down like I owned the place, which, technically, I did. "Who exactly graded these? Was this you, Jane? Or was this a collaborative effort?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but Jane, to her credit, didn't try to soften it. "We all kind of contributed," she said. "We talked through the categories, went over some examples, and—" "So it was a committee," I said. "It was more of a panel, a jury." I nodded slowly. "Got it." Thea made a small noise that might have been a laugh she was trying to swallow. I looked at all 4 of them and asked the question that had occurred to me approximately 12 seconds after reading the header of that document. "Have any of you made one of these for your husbands?" The silence this time was a completely different kind of silence. It was the silence of 4 people who had walked confidently into a room and suddenly realized the floor plan was nothing like they expected. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "This is more of a psychological tool for self-reflection. It's based on some research that's a no," I said. Meredith tried. "We haven't gotten around to—" Also a no. Thea just looked at her wine glass like it had personally betrayed her. I leaned back in my chair. "Here's my concern," I said. And I said it the way you explain something very obvious to someone who is pretending not to understand it. If we're going to conduct research into the state of American marriages on a Friday evening, the methodology has to be sound. You can't evaluate one data point and call it a study. That's just a complaint with a spreadsheet attached. Jane pressed her lips together. I could tell she was trying very hard not to smile, which told me everything I needed to know about how this was actually going to go. "Nobody leaves?" I said, and I used the voice. I don't use the voice often. It's not something I decided to develop. It just kind of appeared one day, probably around the third time I had to return a contractor's work on the kitchen remodel. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. It's just the kind of voice that communicates, without any ambiguity whatsoever, that the statement it is delivering is not a suggestion. All three of Jane's friends sat back down. Their faces cycled rapidly through surprise, confusion, and what I can only describe as the specific expression of someone who has realized they may have miscalculated. I asked Jane to get more paper and some markers. While she was in the kitchen, I went to the fridge, grabbed the wine bottle for the table and a beer for myself. If I was going to be tried, I was at least going to be comfortable while I watched the proceedings go sideways. What happened over the next 40 minutes was one of the most genuinely entertaining things I have ever witnessed in my own home, and I once watched our neighbor try to reverse a rental truck into his driveway for an hour and 15 minutes. The moment each woman started filling out a scorecard for her own husband, the dynamic in that room shifted completely. It was like watching a nature documentary, the kind where you think you know which animal is the predator, and then the camera angle changes. Sarah started strong, giving her husband a solid 7 for romance, and Meredith immediately said, "Didn't he forget your anniversary and your birthday in the same calendar year?" Sarah's pen hovered over the paper. The 7 became a 5. Meredith, clearly emboldened, gave her own husband an 8 for emotional support, and Thea, without even looking up, said, "Didn't he spend 4 hours playing golf the day after you had your wisdom teeth out?" The 8 became a 6. Meredith looked at the paper like it had insulted her personally. Thea was trying to argue, with some passion and a fair amount of hand gesturing, that her husband deserved at minimum an 8 for appearance. The other 3 turned to look at her with the kind of gentle, unified skepticism that only comes from years of knowing someone very well. Thea eventually wrote down a 6 and took a long drink of wine. I sat in the corner with my beer and watched all of it unfold. I hadn't touched a single scorecard. I hadn't scored anyone. I hadn't even commented except once when Sarah asked me how I thought the romance category should be defined, and I told her I thought that was a fascinating question for the committee to work through independently. The thing is, they had come into my house on a Friday night, built a case against me, assembled a panel of judges, printed the verdict, and waited to present it over wine and a charcuterie board. It was genuinely well organized. I'll give them that. They had absolutely prepared. They just hadn't accounted for the possibility that I'd open the cage myself. The scorecards got filled out, every single one of them. And here's the part that genuinely made my night. The husbands of Sarah, Meredith, and Thea ended up with almost exactly the same scores as me. 4s, 5s, the occasional 6. Not a single man in the room, apparently, was living up to the standard that existed exclusively inside his wife's imagination. I looked at those papers and thought, so it's not just me. It's all of us. We're all apparently running at about a 50% efficiency rating as human beings. That's when something clicked. These were not bad women. Individually, each of them was perfectly reasonable. Sarah was funny and sharp. Meredith was genuinely kind when she wasn't in committee mode. Thea brought good wine and once helped Jane repaint the guest room without being asked. Decent people, all 3 of them. But something happened when they got together. It was like a chemical reaction, the kind where each ingredient is harmless on its own, and then you combine them and suddenly you've got something that'll strip paint. They pushed each other toward the negative. One woman remembered an old grievance, another topped it, the third validated it, and before long, they'd collectively talked themselves into a worldview where all 4 of their husbands were marginally functional disappointments in need of formal documentation. 4 reasonable women, one remarkably toxic group chat with charcuterie, but I wasn't done yet. "There's one category missing from this whole system," I said. They looked at me. "Wives," I said. "Nobody scored the wives." And that's when the energy in the room shifted completely for the second time that evening. The objections came fast. Sarah went first. Something about how the husband is the primary driver of the household dynamic, that the emotional temperature of a marriage is set by the man, that research shows. I genuinely cannot tell you how much research got cited at me on that particular Friday night, but I can tell you none of it came with footnotes. Meredith backed her up with something about emotional labor. Thea nodded very seriously and mentioned a podcast. I almost laughed. I held it together, but it was close. Because none of them believed what they were saying. I could tell. There's a specific quality to an argument a person doesn't fully believe. It gets louder faster than it should, and the eye contact gets slightly too intense. These were not the words of women who had thought this through. These were the words of women who had walked into a trap and were hoping volume would help. I waited until they finished. Then I explained calmly that marriage is a team sport. It is not a one-man operation with 3 performance reviewers in the stands. If we were going to build a system for evaluating relationships, then the system needed to cover both sides of the relationship. That wasn't radical. That was just math. "So here's what I'm proposing," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon, I'm doing a barbecue. Backyard. You 3 bring your husbands." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than all the other silences that evening. This one had texture to it. Their faces, and I want to be precise here, looked exactly like the faces of people who have just been informed they are required to attend their own trial. There was a moment where I could physically see each of them running through possible exits in their heads. A prior commitment. A family thing. One of the kids might be coming down with something. I didn't give them the opening. "Call them right now," I said, "while you're here." Jane looked at me. I looked back at her. She got up and got herself more wine, which I interpreted as support. 3 phones came out. 3 calls got made. And this is the part where the universe decided to fully commit to my side of the evening, because judging by the voices I could hear from across the table, all 3 of those men were genuinely cheerful, easygoing guys. The moment the word barbecue landed, they were in. No hesitation, no negotiating, no checking a calendar. One of them, I'm pretty sure, said yes before the sentence was even finished. Their wives, meanwhile, were trying in real time to invent reasons why tomorrow might not work, even as their husbands were already asking what to bring. Too late. I had won. The barbecue was happening. Before I let anyone leave, I collected all the scorecards. And then, and I'll admit this was my favorite moment of the entire evening, I asked each woman to sign hers. Dated, signed, witnessed. Because I had a feeling that by morning, certain scores might have experienced some convenient revision, and I wanted the historical record to be clean. They signed, they left, the door closed. The house went quiet for the first time in hours. Jane stood in the middle of the living room looking like someone who had just watched a nature documentary take an unexpected turn. She wasn't upset exactly. She was processing. I could see it happening in real time. The gradual realization that the evening had not gone remotely the way anyone had planned when they set out those candles. And then, slowly, she started to smile. She told me she'd never seen me like that confident, that deliberate. She said it was actually kind of impressive. Coming from Jane, who does not hand out compliments the way some people hand out business cards, that meant something. Then I asked her, gently, genuinely, how my scores had actually gotten that low. She hesitated. Then she told me the truth. She'd wanted to give me higher marks. Multiple times on multiple categories, her instinct had been to write a better number. But every time she started to, one of her friends would remember a story, or raise an eyebrow, or suggest that maybe she was being too generous, and Jane, being Jane, who is trusting and warm and genuinely believes the best about the people she loves, which is one of the things I love most about her, had let herself get talked down. That's when I told her what I'd been thinking. Her friends had come into our home to fix our marriage, which would be a generous gesture if their own marriages were in noticeably better shape, which, based on the scorecards currently sitting on our kitchen counter, they were not. And the thing that bothered me most, the thing I wanted her to actually hear, was that the target of this whole exercise wasn't just me. It was her too. Because the subtext of handing your friend a document that says her husband is a 4.5 out of 10 is not, "We want you to be happy." It's, "We want you to see things the way we see things." Jane went quiet. Not defensive quiet, genuinely quiet, the kind where you can tell something landed. She's a good person. She's the kind of person who doesn't realize when she's being influenced because she assumes everyone else means as well as she does. It's a beautiful quality and occasionally a liability, and I knew this wasn't the moment to hammer the point. So I didn't. I put my arm around her. I told her she married well, arguably better than a 4.5, but I was willing to let the committee reconvene on that. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that means the tension has actually broken. We cleaned up the candles, the glasses, the charcuterie board that had served its purpose, and then some. I told Jane that the people who love you the most should make you feel good about your life, not systematically audit it until you feel like a spreadsheet error. She thought about that for a while, then she said she'd think about it some more. That was good enough for me. Friday was over, Saturday was coming, and something told me Saturday was going to be considerably more interesting. Peter and Meredith pulled up first, right around 2 in the afternoon. Then Jake's truck appeared at the curb with Sarah in the passenger seat. Liam and Thea came last, about 10 minutes later, Thea carrying a bowl of something covered in plastic wrap, like she was trying to prove this was a normal social gathering and not a carefully arranged follow-up to the strangest Friday night our neighborhood had ever seen. Jane and I had set everything up earlier. Drinks in the cooler, chairs arranged in the backyard, me stationed at the grill like a man with absolutely nothing on his agenda except meat and good weather, which was exactly the impression I wanted to give. Honestly, I expected awkwardness. I had mentally prepared for it. Some stiff hellos, a little careful conversation, the general energy of people who know something is unresolved and are pretending otherwise. Instead, within about 15 minutes, something unexpected happened. I liked these guys. I want to clarify that until today we knew each other very poorly, you could say in absentia. Peter turned out to be a car guy, not just casually, but genuinely. He started asking questions about my truck almost immediately, and we ended up in a 20-minute conversation about engine work that Jane later described as two strangers falling in love over a mechanical breakdown. Which, fair. Jake was a fisherman, the real kind, early mornings, specific rivers, strong opinions about lures, and somehow we found 30 years of shared fishing logic between us in the time it took to finish one beer. Liam was a football guy, the kind who remembers specific plays from games that happened a decade ago, and within 5 minutes of meeting him, I had upgraded my general opinion of Thea significantly, because anyone who could live with that level of sports commentary dedication had earned some patience points. The afternoon settled into something genuinely relaxed. Burgers on the grill, cold beers, easy laughter. These were good people, the kind you'd actually want to spend a Saturday with. The women, though, were a different story. Jane was doing her best. She knows how to hold a social situation together, always has, but Sarah, Meredith, and Thea had the specific energy of people waiting for a shoe to drop. They were smiling, contributing to conversation, doing everything right on the surface. But underneath it there was this watchful tension, the kind you get when you know something's coming and you can't figure out the angle yet. When the food was done, and everyone had plates, and the afternoon had gotten comfortable enough, I decided it was time. I mentioned casually that Jane and her friends had recently gotten interested in relationship psychology, that they'd started a little experiment, kind of a structured way to evaluate partnerships and identify areas for growth, that the first step, naturally, was an honest assessment of your partner. Peter, Jake, and Liam all looked mildly curious. No suspicion, no resistance. Just the open, reasonable response of men who had shown up for a barbecue and were willing to see where things went. I handed out paper and markers. And then, because I had learned something the previous evening about what happens when certain people are in the same room during an evaluation process, I sent the women inside. Drinks, snacks, comfortable chairs. They could catch up. We'd be fine out here. The door closed. I looked at the three of them. What happened next was the thing I found most interesting about the entire 2-day experiment. Nobody went looking for problems. That was the difference. That was the whole thing, right there. Not one of those men, not Peter, not Jake, not Liam, started the process by trying to remember grievances. Their instinct, every single one of them, was to think about what their wife did well. The conversation wasn't about shortcomings. It was about evidence. It was guys trying to build a case for someone. I kept things honest. I told them that inflating every score to a 10 was just as dishonest as tanking them, and they understood that without much pushback. So we talked through each category with some actual thought behind it. Jake mentioned that Sarah didn't work full-time, so he gave her a 7 on finances, but then immediately added that she managed their household budget better than he ever had, and that her side hobby had started bringing in real money. The 7 felt right to him. Considered, not punitive. He gave her a 9 for support without hesitating for even a second, and when I asked why, he just said, because she carries more than half of everything and never makes me feel bad about it. That was the tone of the whole thing. Arguments, not attacks. Context, not scores used as weapons. When all 4 sheets were filled out, I did one for Jane, same as everyone else. The numbers told a pretty clear story. The women were averaging somewhere between 8 and 9 across the board. Comfortably, honestly, without anyone trying to push the numbers up. That's just where they landed when men who loved their wives actually thought about it. I called everyone back outside. I handed the women their scores first. Watched their faces as they read them. There was surprise there. Genuine surprise. The kind that means the number was higher than expected, and that the gap between what they'd assumed and what was actually on paper was larger than comfortable. Then I picked up the scorecards from Friday night and gave each husband his. And I want to be precise about what I saw on Meredith, Sarah, and Thea's faces in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. It was shame. Real, quiet, sitting right on the surface shame. The kind that doesn't need anyone to point at it, because the person already knows exactly where it's coming from. The guys were a little stung. I won't pretend otherwise. 4s and 5s have a way of landing even when you're trying to stay rational about it. So I handed everyone a fresh beer and let the moment breathe for a minute. And then, and this is the part that still surprises me a little when I think about it, nobody exploded. Nobody pulled their spouse aside for a tense side conversation. Nobody got up and left. 3 men looked at their scores, looked at their wives, and made the quiet decision that this was information rather than an indictment, which meant there was actually something to work with. So I made a suggestion. We'd started something here. It would be a waste to just leave it on the table. What if we gave it a real month? Everyone works on the areas they know need work. Husbands have their own group chat. Wives have theirs. Share ideas, check in with each other, put in actual effort, and in 30 days, we all come back together and do it again. Nobody objected, not even Sarah, who I had pegged as the most likely holdout. The evening wrapped up gradually, the way good evenings do. Slowly, with lingering conversations and the last of the drinks, people drifting toward their cars without any particular rush. Handshakes and see you soons and genuine ones, not the polite kind. But as the 3 couples were heading out, I noticed something on Meredith, Sarah, and Thea's faces that I don't think any of them intended to show. It was a kind of bewilderment. Not unpleasant exactly. More like the look of someone who set out to run a particular play and ended up somehow winning a completely different game than the one they thought they were playing. They had arrived Friday night with a scorecard and a verdict and 3 glasses of wine. and what I can only describe as a plan. They were leaving Saturday evening as founding members of the most unexpected couples support group in the history of our cul-de-sac. I stood at the end of the driveway and watched them go. Jane came and stood next to me, and for a moment we were both quiet. "You're something else," she said finally. 4.5, I said. She laughed and went back inside. I took one last look at the yard, the empty cooler, the grill that had served us well. Something told me the next 30 days were going to be genuinely interesting, and I was already looking forward to the rematch. The men's group chat came alive before I'd even finished my Sunday morning coffee. Peter started it, a simple message asking if anyone had good ideas for a date night that wasn't dinner and a movie, because apparently he and Meredith had done dinner and a movie roughly 47 times, and it had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like a scheduled maintenance appointment. Jake jumped in immediately with 3 suggestions. Liam sent a voice memo, which none of us had asked for, but which turned out to be genuinely useful. I added a few ideas, and just like that, 4 guys who barely knew each other a week ago were suddenly collaborating on being better husbands like it was a project with a deadline, which technically it was. I decided early that I was going to take the appearance category seriously. Not because a 4 out of 10 had wounded my ego, though I won't pretend it hadn't at least grazed it, but because I looked at my closet one morning with fresh eyes and realized that approximately 60% of what was in there I had owned since before Jane and I got married, and the rest had been purchased with zero thought beyond "this fits and it's on sale." I spent an evening going through guides on men's style, actual considered ones, not the kind that tell you to buy a blazer and call it a transformation, put together a few options, and shared them in the chat. Peter immediately said he needed to do the same thing. By the end of the week, 2 of us had updated wardrobes, and one group chat had accidentally become a men's style consultation service. Liam's weak spot was support, which he knew and owned without anyone having to say it out loud. His wife, Thea, had apparently been asking him to deal with a list of things around the house for somewhere between several months and the better part of geological time, and Liam had been responding to each request with the particular brand of male optimism that means, "I heard you and I fully intend to get to that eventually." Peter, who turned out to have a useful network of contractors and a good instinct for home repair, stepped in with contacts and advice. Within 2 weeks, Liam had crossed more things off that list than in the previous year combined. He reported this to the group chat with the energy of a man who had just discovered that doing things feels better than not doing things, which the rest of us received with the patience of people who had already known this and were happy he'd arrived. We started meeting in person once a week, a bar not far from our neighborhood, nothing fancy, just somewhere with decent beer and enough backroom noise that a table of 4 guys talking about marriage didn't feel like a confessional. And those evenings, I want to be honest about this, were genuinely good. Not in a forced, "this is therapy" kind of way. In the way that good conversation with people who are rooting for you tends to be good. Nobody was competing. Nobody was keeping score in the bad sense of the word. We were just 4 guys trying to get out of the grooves we'd worn into our own lives and do something better. The women, to their credit, were not sitting still either. Meredith went at her health the way Meredith apparently goes at everything, seriously and with structure. She overhauled what she was eating, got onto a yoga schedule that she actually kept. And over the course of the month, you could genuinely see something shifting. Not just physically, though that was happening too, but in the way she carried herself. She seemed lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the scale. All 4 of the women started doing bike rides together through the parks nearby, which began as exercise and quickly became the kind of weekly ritual that people build their schedules around. Jane came home from those rides with color in her face and good stories, and I noticed that the quality of her mood on those evenings was consistently excellent, which I noted and appreciated without saying anything, because sometimes the smartest thing you can do is just observe and be grateful. Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd had a hobby for a while, I'll leave the details vague because that's her story to tell. But she'd always kept it small, almost apologetically small, like she wasn't sure it deserved to take up real space. That month, she decided to treat it like a business, actually promote it, actually price it properly, actually say yes to the volume of work she was capable of handling. In 30 days, she brought in more than she had in the previous 6 months combined. Jake mentioned it in the group chat with the specific pride of a man whose respect for his wife had just gone up a notch. And we all acknowledged it the way men acknowledge things, briefly, sincerely, and then we moved on. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the competitive edge just dissolved. It had started as a challenge with a scoreboard, and it turned into something I can only describe as a game where everyone was playing on the same team. Jane started leaving me notes, small ones, the kind that don't require a response, just acknowledgement that the other person thought of you in the middle of a regular day. Organized a dinner for the two of us at a restaurant we'd been meaning to try for 2 years and kept not trying. I took her to an outdoor concert on a weeknight and watched her be genuinely, unguardedly happy in a way that reminded me of very early on. The feeling that came back during that month, I keep trying to find a precise word for it, was something like momentum. The sense that we were moving towards something instead of just maintaining position. The complaints stopped, not because everything became perfect, but because complaints are mostly what happen when you're not talking about anything better. We started talking about what we wanted, plans, ideas, the small upgrades to daily life that you stop bothering to mention when you've convinced yourself nothing will change. Things changed. Incrementally, practically, but noticeably. Jane told me about 3 weeks in that Sarah and Meredith and Thea seemed different, more generous with each other, less interested in cataloging what was wrong and more interested in what was actually happening. The group that had arrived at my house 4 weeks ago with printed scorecards and collective judgment had apparently reorganized itself, quietly and without any formal announcement, into something that functioned more like genuine support. The month went by fast. That's always the sign that something was worth doing. The second barbecue happened on a Saturday afternoon, with weather that felt like the universe had checked the calendar and decided to cooperate. Same backyard, same grill, same general arrangement of chairs, but nothing else was the same. People hugged when they arrived, real ones. Peter got out of the car looking like a man who'd had a good month and knew it. Jake was laughing at something before he'd even made it through the gate. Liam, who I had initially pegged as the quietest of the three, turned out to have a genuinely excellent sense of humor once he'd relaxed into the company, and he arrived with it fully operational. The women looked, and I mean this without exaggeration, wonderful. Not in a performed way. In the way that people look when they've been taking care of themselves and feeling genuinely seen by someone. Meredith carried herself differently. Sarah had the specific glow of a person whose work has just started to matter in new ways. Thea seemed lighter, some edge she'd had when I first met her a month ago, just quietly gone. Jane stood next to me for a moment before everyone settled and looked around at the yard full of people laughing, and I could see her doing the math, tracking the distance between that tense Friday evening and this particular Saturday afternoon. "I can't believe this started with a scorecard," she said. I picked up my beer. 4.5, I said. "I've been thinking about it." She shook her head, but she was smiling. I looked around at 8 people who had arrived in each other's lives through the strangest possible door and somehow ended up here, genuinely happy, genuinely improved, genuinely glad to be in the same backyard. 1 month ago, Jane had handed me a piece of paper with my name at the top and a number that was supposed to mean something unflattering. What it had actually done was accidentally start one of the best months any of us had had in years, which only left one question: what happened when we finally ran the numbers again? While the women took over the kitchen to fill out their scorecards, the 4 of us stayed in the backyard with the grill, the last of the steaks, and a conversation about whose wife had become dangerously good at cooking over the past month. Liam was making a case for Thea's new pasta situation with the conviction of a man presenting evidence before a jury. Peter countered with something Meredith had done with a marinade that he described in enough detail that the rest of us went quiet out of respect. We were also filling out our own scorecards, balancing paper on our knees between bites, which is exactly how serious academic research gets done. I already knew, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, that the numbers didn't really matter anymore. Whatever came out of that kitchen, whatever got written on those sheets, we had all already won. You could feel it in the way the afternoon sat. Easy, unhurried, the kind of comfortable that takes time to build and doesn't announce itself when it arrives. When both sides were done, we gathered around the table, and the results were genuinely a little ridiculous. Every couple landed between 9 and 9.5. We had started adding half points somewhere during the month. It made the whole thing feel more considered, more alive. And now those half points were doing real work, because everyone was trying to stay honest, and nobody wanted to just hand out perfect 10s, even when the argument for them was getting pretty strong. The reactions when people saw their numbers were not subtle. Peter saw his score, looked at Meredith, and raised both arms over his head like a man whose team had just won something significant. There was a moment of pure, unguarded joy on his face that I don't think he'd planned and definitely didn't try to hide. Jake laughed, a real one, the kind that starts in the chest. Liam read his paper twice, looked up, and just nodded slowly with the expression of a man receiving information he'd needed for a while. The women weren't any more composed. There were genuine sounds of delight at that table, not polite, not performed. Actual happiness at being seen accurately by someone who loved them. I got up, picked up my drink, and looked around at 7 people who had arrived at this backyard through the strangest possible sequence of events. To strong marriages, I said, and to people who aren't afraid to get better. Every glass went up, and that's when it happened. The thing I hadn't seen coming. Meredith, Sarah, and Thea exchanged a look. The particular kind of look that means something has been discussed in advance, and the moment has arrived to act on it. Sarah reached into the small stack of papers on the table and pulled out a specific sheet. My original scorecard, from 5 weeks ago. Romance 4, support 5, appearance 4, finances 5. Overall husband rating 4.5 out of 10. They tore up this sheet, then took the one that was made today. Each of the 3 of them took a pen. Each of them added half a point to my total. My score became a 10. I started to object. On principle, on methodology, because a 10 felt like great inflation, and I had spent the entire month arguing for honest numbers. And Meredith held up one hand and stopped me. She said that a month ago, they had come into this with entirely the wrong intentions. They had wanted to find fault. They had wanted to complain. They had wanted to fix husbands as though husbands were a project, and they were the project managers. And instead of accepting the frame they'd built, I had flipped the entire table and made every single person in that room look at their own relationship honestly. Her voice was steady when she said it. Not dramatic, just clear. Thea said that her marriage, right now, was better than it had been in several years. Not slightly better, noticeably, meaningfully better. And she said it directly, the way people speak when they're not softening anything, because they want the thing they're saying to actually land. Sarah said she had spent a long time, longer than she'd realized until this month, focusing on what was wrong instead of what was there. That the shift had been harder than she expected and more worthwhile than she'd anticipated. And Meredith, last, smiled in a way that had some real humility in it, and said simply that she'd been wrong from the beginning, that she knew it, and she wanted to say so out loud in front of everyone. I have watched people apologize a lot of times in my life. Most apologies have some amount of self-protection built into them, a qualification, a redirection, a small escape hatch in the wording. These didn't. These were just 3 women sitting at a table in my backyard telling the truth about something and meaning it. Jane was sitting next to me. I could feel her, the specific warmth of someone who is so full of something good that they're almost holding their breath to keep it from spilling. She had brought these women into our house on a Friday evening with a printed sheet and a plan that had gone in every direction except the one intended. And somehow, on the other side of it, everything was better than it had been before any of it started. I thought about what I'd understood, sitting in that backyard. Jane wasn't the problem. Her friends weren't the problem. The scorecard, absurd as it was, wasn't the problem. The problem was the oldest and most mundane problem in long-term relationships. We had all slowly, quietly, without any dramatic moment of decision, started taking each other for granted, started seeing the furniture instead of the person, started cataloging the gap between expectation and reality, instead of paying attention to what was actually in front of us. And somehow, through a combination of Friday night wine, a printed document, a backyard grill, and 3 men who turned out to be exactly the kind of people worth knowing, a ridiculous marriage scorecard had made 8 adults start noticing each other again. The evening ended the way the best evenings end. Slowly, with no one in a hurry to leave, laughter running through the whole thing like a thread. Someone's phone coming out for photos that nobody posed for because nobody needed to. Promises made that weren't really promises so much as statements of obvious fact. Of course we'd keep doing this. Of course we'd keep meeting. Of course this wasn't going to stop just because the official experiment was over. And it didn't stop. The men's chat is still running, the women's too. Peter and Jake and Liam are, without any exaggeration, some of my closest friends now. The kind you didn't know you were missing until they showed up. And then you can't quite remember what the weeks looked like before. We get together regularly, all 4 families, kids included. Our kids have their own friendships now, which is a thing that still catches me off guard sometimes in the best way. Sarah, Meredith, and Thea are, and I want to be precise about this because I've thought about how to say it, genuinely different than they were that first Friday night. Not unrecognizable, not transformed in some dramatic sense, just lighter, less interested in the inventory of grievances, more interested in what's actually happening. The group chat that used to be a place to stockpile complaints became something else, and they did that themselves, without anyone telling them to. Every now and then, when someone in our circle starts in on a prolonged complaint about life, or their spouse, or the general unfairness of things, somebody at the table will look up and say, very casually, "Careful," or William will bring out the scorecards again. And every single time, the whole table laughs. Every time. Because none of us can fully believe that all of it, the friendships, the better marriages, the Saturday afternoons, the kids running around the backyard, the genuine happiness of 8 people who found each other through the most unlikely sequence of events imaginable, started with my wife standing in our living room on a Friday night, holding a piece of paper, smiling way too proudly and saying, "I've created a marriage scorecard." 4.5. Best investment I ever made. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.